The food was still warm, the table set for 5, steam curling from boiled potatoes, bread torn but untouched. Yet the chairs, each one, stood empty. The house breathed only silence. That spring of 1847, a farmer from a nearby plot stumbled upon the Whitmore home in Parowan, Utah. He expected the usual sounds of life: laughter, hymns, a crackling fire. Instead, he stepped into a dining room where supper had been abandoned mid-prayer. Elias Whitmore, a man of scripture and visions, and his 4 wives, Sarah, Martha, Ruth, and Eliza, had vanished. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading into the desert. Only a Bible on the table, its pages damp with what looked like water or tears. The incident was never written in territorial records. No sermons recalled it. Elders spoke only of a necessary cleansing. And yet, in the oral memory of Parowan, the story persisted like a wound beneath the skin. Children whispered of the woman with 4 faces, a figure who walked the canyons at night. Parents silenced them, insisting no such family had ever lived there. But why would a table be set for a family that never existed? Why did neighboring settlers, long after the house was abandoned, still hear the sound of women weeping from the rafters? This is the story of Mr. Whitmore and his 4 wives. A story buried under centuries of dust, denied by institutions, but etched into the soil of the Utah desert itself. The mid-19th century brought a flood of settlers into the Utah Territory. They came hungry, frightened, yet devoted, driven by faith into a land as barren as bone. The soil was unforgiving, the winters merciless. Graves filled quickly, and yet the pioneers clung to belief that God had called them westward to build a new Zion. Among them, a darker doctrine took root. Polygamy, at first whispered in secrecy, spread like a hidden sickness. Some saw it as a test of faith, a commandment from heaven. Others knew it as bondage. Women taken as sister wives bore the weight of obedience, their own desires smothered beneath holy decree. Into this atmosphere arrived Elias Whitmore. Tall, severe, eyes the color of flint. He claimed Massachusetts as his birthplace, though records there barely mention him, except for an expulsion from a theological seminary after unorthodox practices. Whitmore carried himself like a prophet. He spoke of visions in the desert, of a voice that had told him 4 wives would be given as covenant. He found them, whether by persuasion, coercion, or command is unclear. Sarah, steady and faithful. Martha, quiet as a shadow. Ruth, restless, questioning. And Eliza, the youngest, scarcely more than a girl, brought into the home under whispers that she had been purchased from an orphanage. Together, they became an unnatural household. Their windows glowed late into the night, the sound of hymns warping strangely in the wind. Children spoke of hearing voices layered upon one another. For women praying in unison, their words dissolving into something that did not sound human at all. Elias Whitmore was not remembered as a kind man. His neighbors described his smile as a gesture without warmth, a twitch of the lips rather than joy. His voice, though, carried a strange power. When he preached, men leaned closer, and women felt a tightening in their chest. He had a way of speaking that seemed less like persuasion, more like compulsion. He was obsessed with scripture, but he read it differently. Where others saw parable, Elias saw instruction. His sermons twisted holy words into dark mandates. Sacrifice, obedience, purification. He spoke of covenants sealed not with love, but with blood. Before his westward journey, Elias's history was marked by shadows. Expelled from seminary in Boston after fellow students accused him of practicing unsanctioned liturgies. A rumor circulated that he conducted nocturnal rituals in abandoned churches, chanting backwards until the walls bled candle wax. Nothing proven. Nothing recorded in official minutes. But his name disappeared from church rolls, as if erased. In Utah, he reinvented himself as a pioneer patriarch. Yet his wives bore the evidence of another truth. Sarah appeared drained, her once bright eyes dulled. Martha avoided townsfolk altogether. Ruth, boldest among them, was heard muttering that no man is worth 4 broken hearts. And Eliza, the youngest, was seen wandering barefoot in the fields at night, speaking to no one, as though listening for something only she could hear. Neighbors claimed the Whitmore house exuded a presence. Lamps glowed long after midnight. A child swore he saw four silhouettes standing in an upstairs window, though only one wife was meant to occupy that room. And through it all, Elias's figure loomed, stern, skeletal, his grip on his family absolute. It is said that when you looked into Whitmore's eyes, you did not see a man of faith. You saw a void staring back. Every story about Elias Whitmore is incomplete without his wives. To speak of him alone is to miss the structure of his design. For the man insisted that he was nothing without his appointed four. He named them not as individuals but as pieces of a whole. For strands to bind the covenant, he once declared in a gathering, his voice cutting through the dusk like a blade. Sarah, the first wife, carried the burden of normalcy. She had come west already married to Elias, her loyalty cemented long before the desert years. Neighbors remembered her as gentle, her hands always red from work. Yet, over time, she seemed to vanish into herself. Speaking little, her eyes darting nervously whenever Elias entered a room. Martha, the second, was chosen for her silence. A widow with no family left, she moved into the Whitmore home without question. But she never returned anyone's gaze. Visitors said her lips trembled constantly, as though she were reciting prayers beneath her breath. Ruth, the third, did not bend so easily. Outspoken and restless, she questioned Elias in front of others, sometimes mocking his visions. Her defiance did not last long. Within months she grew pale, brittle, as if drained of her fire. Eliza, the fourth and final, remained the most disturbing presence. Barely more than a girl, she had been taken from an orphanage in the East. Elias called her the Lamb. Locals whispered she was too young, too vacant. She often walked the fields barefoot, her nightgown trailing in the dirt, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the horizon. Children who encountered her said she smelled of smoke and salt water. Each wife became a fragment of something larger. Obedience, silence, rebellion, innocence, woven into a design Elias claimed was sacred. Yet to the outside world, they looked like women slowly erased, drawn thin as parchment, as though their very selves were being consumed by the covenant Elias had bound them to. And together they sang, always singing, for voices blending in strange harmony, their hymns echoing across the canyon. Times it sounded holy, times it sounded like mourning. In any settlement, power flows upward. And in 1847 Utah, the church was the highest authority. The elders, those appointed to keep order, heard murmurs about the Whitmore family long before disaster struck. It began as gossip, late-night gatherings in the Whitmore home, the wives' faces pale in lamplight as they recited scripture not recognized by the book. Elias had grown bold in his preaching. He spoke of new revelations, instructions given to him alone by an unseen messenger in the desert. For wives, one covenant, he said. One man, 5 vessels. Elder Crandall, a man whose journals have survived in fragments, recorded his suspicions. Something in Whitmore's house is not of heaven. His hymns are turned backward, and the sound of his wives is not prayer but torment. I heard one scream as though childbirth had no end. Other elders tried to silence him. They argued that Elias was simply zealous, that his household was an experiment in devotion. But Crandall noted a darker truth. The wives were disappearing from public life, rarely seen outside, their voices the only sign they lived. Townsfolk whispered that Elias held midnight rites. Candles placed in windows, curtains drawn tight, shadows shifting unnaturally on the walls. A boy claimed he saw Elias kneeling before his wives as they stood in a circle, their mouths moving in unison though no words came out. These were dismissed as stories until the first wife vanished. In every forgotten history, there is a witness. Someone overlooked, someone discounted, whose memory becomes the last thread connecting truth to silence. For the Whitmore case, it was a child, a farm boy named Nathaniel who lived half a mile away. He was 8 years old in the spring of 1847, when he woke to the sound of singing carried on the wind. It was not unusual to hear hymns, but this was different. Louder, fractured, rising in waves that made his teeth ache. He crept to his window and saw lanterns moving across the desert. 5 figures, Elias at the front, 4 women behind. They walked as if pulled by invisible cords, their heads tilted, their arms slack at their sides. Nathaniel said they looked like broken dolls, their feet dragging through the sand. He followed them as far as the ridge, where the earth split into a dark canyon. The group descended into it. He swore he heard the wives crying, 4 voices melting into one, until he could not tell where one woman ended and the next began. Nathaniel told his parents. They struck him for lying. He told the elders. They ordered him silent. Years later, as an old man, he still remembered that night. His testimony was found in a letter after his death. They went into the canyon, and the canyon swallowed them. I heard not prayer, but the sound of stone grinding against stone. It was not human. The boy had seen something no one else dared to admit. Elias was not leading his family in worship. He was leading them into the earth. There is a place just outside Parowan where the earth cracks open into a narrow gorge. The native Paiute tribes called it the place of returning voices. If you shouted into its depths, the echo did not come back as your own. It came back distorted, older, like a stranger borrowing your breath. Elias Whitmore was drawn to it. He was seen there often by hunters, by travelers passing in the distance. Always with his wives. Always carrying lanterns. He believed the fissure was a threshold. In his surviving notes, fragments scratched onto torn pages of scripture, he described it as a door cut into the belly of the earth, a mouth waiting to swallow covenant. Locals whispered of what he left there. Fresh-baked bread, pieces of fabric torn from his wives' dresses, even locks of their hair. Once, a boy collecting firewood swore he saw Elias emptying a basin of blood into the dust. The wives standing motionless, their faces tilted toward the canyon sky. What disturbed witnesses most was the sound. Not hymns, not prayers, something harsher. Wives chanting in unison, but in words no one recognized. A language that scraped against the ears. One woman from a nearby household told her daughter she heard the wives long after they'd gone, their voices bleeding from the fissure itself. 4 voices, but only 1 breath, she said. As though they had become one body. It was at this fissure that Whitmore's obsession sharpened into mania. He began to speak less of heaven and more of the soil that remembers. He told neighbors the desert was alive, and that it was whispering promises to him in the night. It began quietly, as all disasters do. Martha, the second wife, the widow with trembling lips, was simply gone. When neighbors asked, Elias answered calmly, "She was taken up." His tone was matter-of-fact, as though announcing the weather. Sarah, Ruth, and Eliza said nothing. Their silence was heavier than denial. The church records of Parowan list Martha as departed eastward. Yet no wagon train remembered her. No trail bore her name. Only one rumor persisted, that her grave lay in a dry well behind the Whitmore house. Children dared each other to approach the well. They said if you dropped a stone, you would not hear it hit bottom. Instead, you'd hear a woman's sigh, faint but unmistakable. Sarah was soon seen with Martha's shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Ruth stopped speaking entirely. And Eliza was found digging holes in the earth near the fields, as if searching for something just below the surface. Elder Crandall wrote of it in his journal. The second wife is missing. The others grow thinner by the day. Whitmore preaches of ascension, yet I feel only burial. The town turned its face away. No one pressed further. Martha had vanished, and her absence became part of the silence surrounding the Whitmore family. Whitmore's reach extended beyond his wives. He was known to invite children from the local orphanage to his home for scripture lessons. At first, it was considered a kindness. The children were given bread, taught hymns, made to feel part of a family. But those children grew up, and years later, their testimonies bled through the cracks of silence. They remembered the basement most of all. Candlelight dripping against damp stone walls. The smell, thick, cloying, a mixture of mold and something sweetly rotten. On those nights, Elias read from his Bible, but the words did not sound like scripture. The wives stood behind him, each holding a candle, their eyes fixed on the children with a stillness that felt predatory. One survivor recalled him sung in a circle. The children were instructed to close their eyes, to drink water blackened with ash. If they hesitated, Elias placed his hand on their head, pressing hard until their vision blurred. Another survivor spoke of scratching sounds in the walls, as though something trapped inside was trying to get out. The wives would pause their song, tilt their heads and listen, then resume singing louder than before. No official records of these gatherings exist. The orphanage books were scrubbed clean. Yet decades later, in whispered recollections, adults still spoke of the Whitmore house as the place where their childhoods ended. They were told they were learning to sing the mother's song, but many remembered only the terror. For women staring at them with hollow eyes, as if waiting to see which child would be chosen. Every Sunday, without fail, the Whitmore house bled sound into the valley. Hymns, twisted, uneven, yet unmistakably fervent, rolled out of its windows like smoke. Even those who despised Elias admitted his household sang with a strange force, for voices weaving together in something that was neither beautiful nor holy, but undeniably powerful. And then, one Sunday in late summer, there was nothing. No voices, no hymns, no flicker of candlelight through the curtains. Just silence. Neighbors gathered on their porches, craning their necks. A woman said it felt like holding her breath, waiting for a scream that never came. Another swore she heard a low hum, not music, but the grinding of stone under water. That evening, the silence broke. A single voice, Elias's, high and trembling, rose faintly from the house. Not a hymn, but a single note, held too long, until it cracked into a sob. The next day, Elias stood before the church congregation. His sermon was calm, deliberate. He spoke of covenants sealed in silence, of voices now harmonized beneath the earth. His words left the congregation chilled, though few admitted it aloud. For the first time, even the elders stopped defending him. Something had shifted. The Whitmore house no longer sounded like devotion. It sounded like absence. Came without warning. A single night, remembered by dozens of witnesses, each describing the same terror in their own words. The first scream erupted just past midnight. High, piercing, unmistakably female. Then another, and another, until the air itself seemed to fracture under the weight of 4 voices shrieking in unison. Neighbors pressed themselves against walls, clutching their children. No one dared approach. The sound rose and fell for nearly an hour, punctuated by a rhythm, like chanting between the screams, words too garbled to decipher. Then came the final cry, louder than the rest, almost inhuman, stretched beyond the capacity of lungs. Windows rattled, dogs howled. The desert itself seemed to echo back. And then silence. At dawn, Elias appeared at the settlement square. Calm, composed, his clothes immaculate. He preached a short sermon, only 7 minutes long, declaring, "The covenant is bound. The seal is closed." Not one wife stood beside him. Within days, the Whitmore household was empty. A neighbor, sent to check on the family, described the discovery. The supper table set for 5, food steaming as though freshly served. Bread rolls torn, potatoes half-eaten, butter melting on plates. Yet every chair was empty. No sign of struggle. No overturned furniture. No footprints outside. Only a Bible left open on the table, the pages warped as though wet, though no water was present. Some swore the stains resembled tears. Others whispered it was blood thinned with water. Elias Whitmore and his 4 wives had vanished. The official records make no mention. Church documents refer only to a necessary cleansing. Elder Crandall, who had long warned of Elias's corruption, wrote his final entry. "They are gone. The table is still warm, but the house is colder than the grave." Rumors flourished. Some claimed the family had ascended. Others believed Elias had led them into the desert, never to return. The most persistent whisper was darker still, that the wives were buried beneath the floorboards, and that Elias had been swallowed whole by the fissure in the canyon. The Whitmore name was erased from sermons, from ledgers, from memory. But the land did not forget. Those who passed the abandoned house said they heard weeping in the rafters, for voices layered as one. And always, in the stillness of night, the table seemed to wait, set for 5 who would never return. After the Whitmore's disappearance, fear spread like contagion. Neighbors whispered of shadows in the windows, of voices echoing when no one stood inside. Livestock shied from the property, braying in terror when led too near. The church elders, unwilling to let rumors spiral, declared the land tainted. Their solution was swift: burn it down. Witnesses recall the day vividly. Men gathered with torches, women clutching their children. The house stood rigid, its windows dark. When the flames caught, they rose too quickly, as if the wood had been waiting for fire. And yet, the blaze did not consume. The structure smoldered, beams collapsing inward, but never turning fully to ash. Weeks passed, and still the ground hissed with smoke. At night, settlers swore they saw faint embers glowing where the house once stood, like eyes half buried in soot. The elders called this a cleansing, but privately some admitted failure. They had expected destruction. Instead, the ruin lingered, blackened timbers jutting like bones from the earth, smoke twisting skyward as if something beneath refused release. Elder Crandall's journal noted, "The fire takes, but it does not devour. The land rejects the flame. Perhaps it keeps what it owns." In time, families avoided the site altogether. Children dared each other to run past at dusk, claiming the ashes whispered. And though the structure was gone, neighbors swore the smell of food, boiled potatoes, fresh bread, still drifted from the ruins when the wind turned east. The cleansing had failed. What had been bound in the Whitmore house refused to be undone. Decades passed. The story of Elias Whitmore blurred into folklore. Yet in 1892, a young archivist named Thomas Reddick stumbled upon something in the church vaults, an object mislabeled and half-hidden among old ledgers. It was a journal, bound in cracked leather. The name E. Whitmore scratched faintly across the cover. Reddick, curious, read by lamplight. The entries were fragmented, many smeared or illegible, but what survived was chilling. Elias wrote of the 4 faces within one bride, and of a door in the canyon where voices enter and do not leave. He described his wives not as women, but as vessels, earth, air, fire, water, each bound to me, each offering part of the covenant. One passage, nearly torn through from heavy ink, read, "The soil remembers. It drinks what we give, and in return it speaks. I have heard the song that precedes creation. It is not for men to hear, but I have heard it." Reddick showed the journal to no one. Within weeks, he vanished. His boarding room left in perfect order, supper set neatly on the table, the chair empty. When elders searched, the journal was gone too. Some whispered it had been returned to the canyon. Others believed it still circulates, passed secretly from hand to hand, carrying with it the same sickness Elias once spread. The children who once sat in Elias Whitmore's basement grew into adults, haunted, broken, yet unwilling to forget. By the early 1900s, several began to speak. Their memories converged on one detail: the ash water. They were forced to drink from cups where black flakes floated like charred snow. Elias told them it was purification, but the taste, bitter, metallic, remained with them for life. Some claimed their teeth loosened after, their gums blackened. One orphan, a woman named Clara, described waking to find herself standing in the basement corner, candle in hand, though she remembered nothing of how she got there. Another, Joseph, said he still woke in the night humming the mother's song Elias forced them to sing. He could never recall the words, only the rhythm, heavy as a heartbeat. Psychologists dismissed these testimonies as shared trauma. Yet the survivors' accounts contained eerie consistencies. The smell of decay, the scratching in the walls, the wives watching with lifeless eyes. Most disturbing were their dreams. Each spoke of a woman, not four but one, whose face shifted constantly, as though made from all the wives at once. This figure stood at the edge of their beds, whispering, "You are mine. You were always mine." The children of the orphanage never fully escaped the Whitmore house. They carried it in their sleep, in their blood, in their silence. And their voices, scattered across decades, form the only surviving testimony of what Elias tried to build. A covenant not with God, but with something older, something buried in the desert itself. As decades passed, historians digging through church archives began to notice gaps. Entire sections of ledger books missing, pages torn neatly away. Whenever Elias Whitmore's name should have appeared, there was only silence. But not all traces were erased. Letters between elders survive in private collections, their contents never meant for public eyes. In one, Elder Crandall warns, "Whitmore is not a prophet but a contagion. His covenant is not with heaven but with the soil." Another letter, and signed, speaks of his wives as "for vessels broken and poured into one chalice." It cautions that their disappearance was not death but a union completed, a body remade. Even the U.S. territorial census of the late 1840s bears peculiar anomalies. Entire households around Parowan are unlisted, as though erased. Scholars suggest deliberate omission, but local tradition insists those families saw too much and were relocated or worse. The deeper one searches, the clearer the pattern becomes. Whitmore's story was not forgotten by accident. It was buried deliberately, sealed beneath layers of silence by both church and state. Yet the earth remembers. Survivors whispered. Children dreamed. The canyon echoed. Suppression only sharpened the legend. The Whitmores had not simply vanished. They had become a wound in history, hidden but unhealed. Time erases most scars, but the Whitmore land refused healing. By 1921, a family of settlers, newcomers with no memory of the old story, chose to build on the ruins. They cleared the scorched timbers, laid new foundations, and raised a modest home upon the cursed ground. At first, life seemed ordinary. The family spoke of fertile soil, of crops that sprouted quickly. Too quickly. Their garden grew thick, choking itself in abundance. Vegetables splitting open on the vine before ripening. Chickens laid eggs with double yolks. Then came the voices. The wife of the new settler, a woman named Caroline, reported hearing weeping in the rafters at night. Their youngest child woke screaming of the woman with many faces. The husband tried to dismiss it, until one morning he found the supper table set neatly for 5, though only 4 members of the family lived in the house. Within months, the settlers vanished. Neighbors found the home abandoned, the food left half-eaten, chairs empty. The building itself collapsed weeks later, as if swallowed into the soil. The land remained bare after that. No one dared build again. As decades passed, historians digging through church archives began to notice gaps. Entire sections of ledger books missing, pages torn neatly away. Whenever Elias Whitmore's name should have appeared, there was only silence. But not all traces were erased. Letters between elders survive in private collections, their contents never meant for public eyes. In one, Elder Crandall warns, "Whitmore is not a prophet but a contagion. His covenant is not with heaven but with the soil." Another letter, and signed, speaks of his wives as "for vessels broken and poured into one chalice." It cautions that their disappearance was not death but a union completed, a body remade. Even the U.S. territorial census of the late 1840s bears peculiar anomalies. Entire households around Parowan are unlisted, as though erased. Scholars suggest deliberate omission, but local tradition insists those families saw too much and were relocated or worse. The deeper one searches, the clearer the pattern becomes. Whitmore's story was not forgotten by accident. It was buried deliberately, sealed beneath layers of silence by both church and state. Yet the earth remembers. Survivors whispered. Children dreamed. The canyon echoed. Suppression only sharpened the legend. The Whitmores had not simply vanished. They had become a wound in history, hidden but unhealed. By the 1940s, America had modernized. The frontier was gone. Railroads carved the land, and electricity lit towns that once clung to oil lamps. But some shadows do not recede. Paranormal investigators, drawn by whispers of the Whitmore story, began to visit the ruins. They carried primitive recording devices, eager to capture proof. Most found nothing but wind, but a few returned pale, shaken, unwilling to speak on record. One reel survived, a brittle strip of audio from 1946. First only static, then faintly the sound of women singing. For voices, low, mournful. Their words unintelligible yet heavy with grief. The song lasts 37 seconds before dissolving back into static. Researchers who've heard it describe a pressure in the chest, an almost physical weight, as though the sound itself demanded obedience. Local children still spoke of dreams. The woman with 4 faces appeared at their bedsides, whispering promises they could never remember upon waking. Farmers avoided the land altogether, swearing that their animals refused to cross it. One soldier returning from the war described walking past the canyon at dusk. He claimed he saw 5 figures. A man in black, standing ahead of 4 women, each veiled. When he called out, they vanished into the fissure, leaving only the echo of footsteps. By then, the Whitmore tale was little more than a campfire story. But the desert did not forget. It carried their voices, carried their hunger, carried their covenant. History is not made only of battles and victories. It is made of what we bury, what we erase, what we dare not speak of in daylight. Elias Whitmore and his 4 wives are gone. Their house burned, their names stricken, their graves, if any, lost to sand. But the silence surrounding them speaks louder than memory. It tells us that some wounds cannot be healed, only hidden. The Whitmore wives were not remembered as women, but as symbols: obedience, silence, rebellion, innocence, woven into a design that consumed them. Whether Elias was a madman, a false prophet, or something worse, his covenant left scars not only on his family, but on the land itself. What remains is a story of erasure, of how institutions conceal what they cannot control, how families carry trauma across generations, how soil itself remembers what is poured into it. The Whitmores vanished nearly 2 centuries ago. Yet even now, on nights when the wind is sharp and the canyon breathes back your echo, some say you can still hear it. 4 voices crying as one. A covenant that never ended.